Our next presentation is entitled Soft Forms and Hard Finishes, an experimental approach to mannequins representing real people. Jennifer Nieling is the owner of JLN Costume Mounting, LLC. She is an independent costume and textile specialist. She has mounted costumes for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Academy Museum of Motion Picture, the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She holds a Master of Art in Fashion and Textile Studies, History, Theory, and Museum Practices from the Fashion Institute of Technology. Mina is a conservator of textiles at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. She previously served as head of the Textile Conservation Lab with the Winter Tour Museum and affiliated associated assistant professor of the Winter Tour University of Delaware Program in Art Conservation, and as associate conservator with the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
So it should start with Laura's part, which is pre-recorded.
An experimental approach to mannequins representing real people. This map shows the area where the project took place, and we gratefully acknowledge the native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their home here today. For the presentation, I'll start by sharing information about the background of the project and some of the mannequin research and planning. Then Jennifer will share a lot of details about creating soft forms, achieving hard finishes, as well as reflections and future thoughts. The mannequins described in this presentation are part of a redesign of a permanent gallery space in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which we'll refer to as NMAAHC. Forces for Change, Mary McLeod Bethune and Black Women's Activism explores renowned educator and reformer Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and other Black women social change agents, past and present. The new installation features garments worn by three iconic activists: Stacey Abrams, a politician and activist who founded Fair Fight Action, an organization that advocates for voter rights and access; Marian Wright Edelman, a lawyer and activist who founded the Children's Defense Fund, which focuses on children's advocacy and research; and Bree Newsom, a filmmaker and activist who removed the Confederate battle flag from the South Carolina State House in 2015. As I considered how we could display the garments worn by these amazing women, some of my thoughts focused more on the garments, and some focused more on the women. Of course, I want mannequins to physically support garments, but it's equally important that the mannequins support the curatorial narratives and are appropriate representations of the people who wore the clothes. Thinking about these garments, all three outfits are stretch fabric and rely on the mannequin for shape. With one outfit in black and another in medium gray, neither of these seemed like good color choices for the mannequins. Thinking about the women, the curatorial focus is on the actions of the women, not the design of their garments. And Bree Newsom was engaged in a very athletic activity while wearing her outfit. Most of the mannequins at NMAAHC are minimalist forms, with fabric covering any exposed areas on the mannequins. This style was used for Stacey Abrams' dress in a previous exhibition. For the Bethune room, I proposed a new style of mannequin that would have a full body and would have a painted finish instead of a fabric cover. I thought the full body would allow for a more personal representation, while the painted finish would create greater visual contrast between the mannequin surface and the garment. My primary research inspiration for the new mannequins came from exhibits at the Victoria and Albert and the National Museum of the American Indian. I shared my ideas with the curatorial and exhibition design teams, and this is a slide from that presentation. I compiled biographical and visual research for each woman to better understand their accomplishments and personalities, as well as typical posture and gestures. In the bottom right of the slide, you can see the first case design drawing with the typical minimalist mannequins that I was proposing we try something new. I shared information about all three of the women with my new proposed mannequins. For Marion Wright Edelman, the reference photograph showing her wearing the gray hoodie doesn't show her arms, but in many of her portraits, her arms are crossed or her hands are clasped. I suggested the pose from this department store display as a way to add some personality to the mannequin with Marion's hoodie. For Stacey Abrams, I considered how to make a static gesture look powerful and engaging without finger pointing, which can look powerful during a speech but can have different connotations in a static mannequin. Also, the pose needed to minimize stress on the shoulders and sleeves since the dress will be on display for 2 years. The pose for Bree Newsome took the most brainstorming, and a lot of different options were considered. In the end, we decided to add a prop flagpole in the case with the mannequin so that it could be posed as if ready to climb. Once everyone agreed on mannequins with more dynamic poses, we discussed options for the heads. We decided to go with faceless egg heads based on limitations of cost and time. To achieve a painted finish on the mannequins, I researched and tested 2 different coating materials. I'm very grateful for the help of interns Joharas Ramos Abreu and Olivia Joseph for testing the working properties, and contractor Lisa Stockebrand for running the Audi test. The coatings were tested on several varieties of different layered materials that we use in the mock mannequins. While paper clay had the best working properties, golden acrylic gesso was the only one to pass the Audi test. Since these mannequins are displayed in a closed case, we needed to meet the highest archival standards. At this point, I want to back up and give a bit more context about our mock mannequins. Our standard is to use commercial Ethafoam mannequins from Dorfman that are highly customized for each garment on display, and we continued this practice for the Bethune Room project. There are many reasons for this. Perhaps most importantly, all of our garments are representing real people and are not selected to show a fashionable ideal. Also, with stretch fabrics, you can't take meaningful measurements of the garments to determine the size of mannequin needed. And to create a custom fiberglass mannequin, you first have to sculpt a form that's used for the mold, which could effectively double the work needed for each mannequin. Soft sculpting can create a naturalistic fit for stretch garments. And Dorfman provides convenient limb attachment hardware, as well as bases and height adjustability. I was so delighted to work with Jennifer on this project, and I'll let her take over the presentation and tell you all about her work.
All right, so it should switch to the computer now, so I can finish the presentation. Can we get the screen switched back to the computer? There we go. All right. So you can see that Dorfman has a pretty wide range of options, from separate parts to full bodies. The size range, however, is limited. These forms are quite small, and they always need to be modified and usually padded out to make the garments fit. So knowing how I typically modify various Dorfman forms, I really looked at this range as a tool set that I could use to build these really specific mounts. And I used parts creatively and sometimes a bit unconventionally to achieve the size and pose that I wanted. My costume mounting process always starts with visual research, especially when it's a real person like these ones. And for Marion Wright Edelman, we had this specific photograph of her in the sweatshirt that I was referencing for fit. For this one, I started with the quote-unquote male suit form because it has a more straight up and down stance. And I found that it's often easier to start with something flatter and build up than to try to reshape pre-existing curves. The suit form also gives you different options for shoulder width, which is important. I did carve down and shape the shoulders and ended up moving the arm joint down. Then I added an Ethafoam neck extension and the Dorfman head, and then padded out the torso, arms, and head to achieve the silhouette that I wanted. To apply the batting, you can actually needle felt it directly onto the foam, which is a really useful technique that I learned from Laura, who learned it from Taein on at the Met. And then finally, once everything is padded out, I cover it with stockinette. And here you can see the mount before we did the finishing. The Dorfman mitten hands worked really well with the hands in the pockets. And you can see that I also created a prop faux turtleneck based on our reference image to complete the display. For Bree Newsom, again, lots of visual research. I tried to find images from different angles to really be able to see how the clothing fits her. And this one needed to have a pose that looks like she's climbing a flagpole. So I started with the regular Dorfman full-body female form, and then used one of their bent legs that's part of their seated mannequin. So I cut the bottom of the right leg off and shaped it, and then I was able to retrofit the bent leg into the front of the form with a pole. And you can see here the forms that I started with, and then after the modifications. As usual, I did a lot of padding and shaping to get the right size and fit. And you usually need a lot more padding than you think you do, especially when you're working with materials that compress it, like the stockings used to cover the mount and the yoga pants themselves. The arms and hands needed to be posable as well, and the arms on the Dorfman full body form worked really well for this. These go into the torso with a relatively long pole, and then the joint is secured with a screw, which can sometimes be an issue for dressing, but it worked well with this particular costume since I had easy access to the joint and could really secure the arm in position. We used a mock-up for the flagpole to test positioning of the arms and hands, and I collaborated with Eric, who is here today, one of the Mountmakers at NMAAHC, to come up with a system to secure the hands to the pole with screws so they wouldn't pull away from the pole, which is what they kind of wanted to do. He also made an acrylic shelf that attaches to the flagpole for the shoe to rest on so the leg would be supported. Stacey Abrams, again, lots of visual research, trying to find multiple angles. Luckily, this was a very well photographed night. And again, I started with the male suit form, and then I added width with Ethafoam planks. I cut this into a rough silhouette to start shaping from, and it was still useful to start with this form rather than carve from scratch in order to start with symmetry and a shoulder line, as well as the built-in joints and hardware. Then I built up this shape with foam and batting, tried the dress on the form periodically, made adjustments. I referenced the photos of her a lot until I finally got to the right silhouette. And for all of these mannequins, I also customized the Dorfman heads to be properly shaped and proportional to the body. I made each arm using a set of thighs as a starting point, both because it gave me more foam to work with and also because it allowed me to create adjustable shoulder, elbow, and wrist joints that allow for a much wider range of pose options. I knew the legs would be very visible, and any Dorfman leg option would have needed so much customization that I decided to just carve the legs from scratch from Ethafoam planks glued together. And the electric turkey carver, which you can see here, worked really well for this. Big fan. Then I sanded the foam down, added a layer of felt to really smooth out the surface. And the pole for this mount actually goes through one of the legs and through the prop shoe as well, so the support pole is hidden. And here's the Stacey Abrams mount before the finishing process. Once it was determined that we would be using gesso instead of the paper clay, we realized that all the visible parts of the forms would need to be covered in fabric to create a smooth and consistent surface to apply the gesso to. I used the sewing machine when possible to get a cleaner finish and tried to keep the seams where they would be least visible, like on the insides of the hands or behind the helmet straps. The heads and hands were the most challenging. On Stacey's head, I ended up doing a narrow twill tape chin strap to keep the chin definition, knowing that I would be covering it in gesso. And once the fabric covers were on, I applied the gesso with foam brushes, which worked well. I found that it took quite a few coats for it to become opaque. The gesso soaked into the fabric, especially where the fabric was more stretched out. The photo on the left was after, I think, 2 or 3 coats, and it took 4 or 5 coats, depending on the body part, to get it fully opaque. And colleagues J.J. McCracken and Eric Hamasfar in the NMAAHC fabrication shop did additional finishing and painting to complete the hard finish. Even after all the layers of gesso, the seams were still visually distracting. JJ and Eric applied layers of golden extra heavy molding paste and Avis epoxy sculpt to bulk and smooth the areas around the seams. This iterative finishing process involved wet and dry sanding, hand sculpting the fingertips with epoxy, and applying paint layers to assess where further refinement was needed. And finally, the forms were painted with an airbrush. A dark gray color was chosen to coordinate with the design of the gallery. Several coats of paint were required, followed by a matte top coat to dull the shine. And here are the finished forms, ready to go into the gallery. Everyone at NMAAHC was very happy with the results, and visitors are very engaged with the display, and we consider this project a success, and we hope you agree. Here is the full gallery. You can see the costumes are in the case on the right. And we learned a lot about materials and process through this experimental approach, and we found that this project was successful in achieving our aim to create very custom mannequins that have the advantages of the soft form to give a realistic and contemporary fit, as well as the look of a hard mannequin that visually contrasts with the fabric of the garments and can be painted in any color. The biggest challenge was how time-consuming it was to achieve the hard finish. And for the future, we want to explore other materials and application methods to streamline the process for the hard finish. JJ has already compiled a list of alternative materials for NMAAHC to Audi test. And like all projects, the success is thanks to a huge team. Many thanks to everyone who contributed to this exhibition, and I personally want to thank Laura for involving me in this great project. And thank you also to IMF for having us, and to all of you for your attention. We should have, where she is? Magic.
Yeah, so when you're applying your gesso, was it a thick first coating, or did you thin it down with water? What was your process in that?
So I was using gesso straight from the container it was purchased in, and I ended up having Laura buy like extra wide foam brushes because I was really trying to like get on as much on there as I could. I was working on other mounts for another project at the same time, so I was like putting on a layer in the morning and then letting it dry and then seeing what it looked like and putting another layer on. So yeah, applying as thickly as I could get it to not drip, basically.
In the thinning down process, as long as you get it to where it's not dripping, you can do a thin coat. Once it solidifies, you can put that thicker coat on top, and it won't be as runny. It'll be smoother. You'll have an easier time.
Okay, maybe for the next round then we can make that adjustment.
We have a question from our virtual audience. What do you use to adhere your Ethafoam planks together?
What do you use to secure the Ethafoam planks together?
Yeah.
I was using hot glue. Yeah, and for the Stacey Abrams leg, I was using planks like around the support pole and basically just building it up around that and then carving it down as needed.
Thank you.
For the shaping stage, is there a reason for mechanical cutting with the turkey cutter, or does it not respond to hot cutting, or?
So I was using the turkey carver because the size that I was dealing with and the amount of carving I was doing, it just made it go faster. It was especially with like a really wide plank, you have a longer blade to cut with than doing it by hand. I didn't catch what the other alternate that was proposed in that question was.
Hot cutter.
Oh, a hot cutter. Yeah, I mean, I think I needed it to be more refined than a hot cutter would have allowed. But yeah, I just found that it was going much faster and smoother with the turkey carver, although I will warn, if you start using it, like give your hand a break because it can make your hand cramp up if you're using it for too long.
So I actually have a quick question about the research. It seems like you really spend a ton of time like looking at material and research and photos and everything, and I feel like those decisions are really, like you're carefully thinking about those decisions because it really affects how people perceive the finished display. Is that something that you're doing all the time, or is this a more recent kind of development?
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I'll throw this to Laura too, but I do visual research for every single thing that I mount to, because costume is fluid, it's not a hard object, so in building them out, you're interpreting what it's going to look like and what that body is supposed to look like, so I think that's a really important part of costume mounting. I think Laura and I are very much on the same page about that and love working together because we sort of speak that same language and have a similar approach. Did you have anything to add, Laura?
I totally agree. I think visual research is just so critical with mounting garments, and in some ways it's easier with contemporary garments because you can find a lot more images more easily of the people wearing the garments to understand their posture, how the clothes fit their body, and if there's video footage, understanding sort of the kinetics of all of that, and then trying to distill all of that into something that, as a static pose on a mannequin, will give good support for the garments, of course, but then also help visitors really connect with the individuals whose stories we want to tell in the galleries, and make sure that that storytelling aspect is really always front in our minds when we're thinking about mannequin poses. And lots of collaboration, so many conversations back and forth with the curatorial teams and the exhibition teams talking about ideas that Jennifer and I had, and making sure that we're all on the same page and in alignment.
Hi, Laura. Hi, Jen. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. It was really great to see how you'd done so much work to recreate the accurate body shapes. And I was just wondering what conversations you'd had around representing sort of skin tone with the finish.
I'll give that one to Laura.
I think I missed hearing just part of the question, what conversations we had about.
Sorry, skin tone with the mannequin finish, if you'd had conversations about trying to represent an accurate skin tone for the individual women.
Yes, so that was a conversation path that we went down with, thinking about if we could do painted finishes that would be personalized for the women's complexions. And in the end, even though there was a lot of interest in that, due to the time constraints of the project, we realized that we didn't have enough time to achieve it to the level that we all wanted to. And so having the uniform gray that was already being used as part of the Mountwork color palette for the exhibit was achievable within the time frame. Just as food for thought, if any of you are going down the path of thinking of painting mannequins to be complexion-based, one of the challenges is that as people, we're not a uniform color from head to toe. There are lots of different areas with different colors on our bodies, even just on our faces. But to paint a mannequin all one color, even if it's a color that relates to the color somewhere on that person's body, it's going to look abstracted and different painted with a mannequin painted all one color. And so this was one of the issues that we ran into in terms of trying to make sure that we were really respectfully representing the individuals. It is something that we're still interested in considering for the future, but it just wasn't achievable within the time frame for this project.
I was curious, the areas that are painted and gessoed, where they're making contact with the garments when they're put on, is there an additional barrier to protect the garment or the textile from the painted surface?
So the only parts that were gessoed and painted were the visible parts. So there is a little, I mean, it has to, go slightly beyond, but there weren't really areas of it touching so much. But Laura, do you have anything to add? I don't think we were too worried about the material being in contact anyways.
Yeah, so we were definitely concerned about having time for the paint to really cure and off-gas, but the overlap portion is extremely minimal. And so that was one of the nice aspects actually of this, where it didn't feel as urgent to put a barrier material between the painted surface and the garments.
Thank you.